You shouldn't be holding that. It's not for someone like you." The voice was like a shard of ice, sharp and cold, cutting through the hushed tension of the 40th floor. Mr. Alastair Finch stood silhouetted against the panoramic window, his form a dark, severe line against the bruised twilight of the city. He didn't turn his head, his gaze fixed on the frantic ballet of traffic below, but his words were aimed with surgical precision. Mara's hands, covered in thin, gray nitrile gloves, did not flinch. She held the document, a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper that had fluttered from a lawyer's overflowing briefcase. It felt important, its weight speaking of signatures and consequences. For a brief second, her eyes scanned the dense block of English text, but it was the line at the bottom that held her, a string of intricate, beautiful characters. Mandarin. She felt a flicker, a ghost of a memory from another life, another room, another version of herself. It was a recognition so deep and instantaneous that it took a conscious effort to keep her expression neutral, to maintain the placid mask of the evening cleaning staff. Finch finally turned, his face a mask of weary impatience. He was a man tailored in ambition, from his silk tie knotted just so to the merciless shine on his Italian leather shoes. He didn't see Mara, the woman. He saw a disruption, a blue uniform where there should have been empty, polished marble, a pair of hands holding something that did not belong to them. "The shredder bin," he commanded, his voice lower now but no less sharp. He gestured with his chin toward a sleek stainless steel receptacle tucked beside a ficus tree. "Now." Mara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her movements were always economical, her presence designed to be forgettable. She had perfected the art of becoming part of the building's ambient hum, a quiet ghost who polished away the day's smudges and sins. She glided across the floor, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound. The paper slid from her grasp into the bin's hungry mouth. The machine whirred to life, a low growl that masticated the Mandarin characters and the English clauses into meaningless confetti. She didn't watch it die. Her focus was already on the next task, her mind a quiet ledger of duties. Clean the glass partition outside the main conference room, disinfect the door handles, check the air filters. Her routine was a fortress, each task a brick in a wall that kept the world at bay. It was a simple, orderly existence, a stark contrast to the chaos she managed behind the closed doors of this floor. From her vantage point in the hallway, the conference room, dubbed the Apex, was a terrarium of anxiety. Inside, a dozen figures were locked in the final, agonizing hours of a $200 million merger. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and rising panic. Their faces were pale under the recessed lighting, their voices a low, urgent murmur that bled through the thick glass. On one side of the monolithic oak table sat the firm's executives, led by their CEO, a man whose exhaustion was visible even from a distance. On the other side, the Chinese delegation, their expressions unreadable, their posture rigid with a silent, simmering frustration. Mara had been cleaning these floors for 2 years. She knew the rhythms of this place better than the people who owned it. She knew that the faint smell of ozone from the server room meant the cooling system was stressed. She knew that the slight flicker in the lights on the east side of the building foreshadowed a deeper electrical issue no one had bothered to report. She knew that the lead negotiator for the Chinese delegation, a stern-looking man named Mr. Chen, took his tea with no sugar, a detail the catering staff consistently got wrong. She noticed things. It was her nature, honed by a life that demanded meticulous observation. And tonight, she noticed the tremor of impending failure. As she sprayed a microfiber cloth with ammonia-free cleaner, preparing to wipe the invisible fingerprints from the glass wall of the Apex, she heard it again. A burst of frustrated Mandarin from inside. The company's interpreter, a young, sweat-drenched man, fumbled with his response. The executives shifted in their seats, their ignorance a palpable weakness. Mara continued her work, her motions fluid and practiced. She was a reflection in the glass, a blue smudge against the drama unfolding within. To them, she was utterly invisible, her presence as mundane as the ficus tree in the corner. They had no idea she understood every word, every nuance, every critical mistranslation that was slowly poisoning the deal. They had no idea that the woman cleaning their fingerprints from the glass knew precisely where the crack in their empire was forming. Would you endure this, to hold the key and be treated like the lock? She pushed the thought away, tucking it into the quiet, orderly fortress of her mind. She had a job to do. Her cart, with its neatly arranged bottles and cloths, was her domain. The quiet hum of its wheels on the marble was her soundtrack. She was here to clean, not to listen. She was here to erase messes, not to decipher them. Finch strode out of the conference room, his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't give her a second glance. He had already forgotten her, the blue uniform already relegated to the background scenery of his important life. But Mara had not forgotten him, and she had not forgotten the characters on that page. They were still there, clear as day in her mind's eye, a warning she was not allowed to speak. She finished the glass, leaving it so clean it seemed to disappear, and quietly wheeled her cart toward the next room, the silent hum of its wheels a temporary balm for the storm gathering within her. Mara's cart was a mobile command center, a marvel of quiet efficiency. Every bottle was labeled, its nozzle turned to the left. Every cloth was folded into a perfect 8-inch square, blue for glass, yellow for surfaces, green for sanitation. It was a system born of a mind that craved order, a mind that saw the world as a series of interconnected processes. To anyone else, it was just a janitor's trolley. To Mara, it was an extension of her own methodical thinking. She began her circuit, leaving the tense atmosphere of the apex behind. Her first stop was the network server room, a humming, refrigerated cavern of blinking lights. The log on the door required a check-in every 12 hours. Most of the night crew just scrawled their initials. Mara ran a diagnostic. She placed her palm against the main chassis, feeling for excessive vibration. She checked the humidity levels on the digital display, and she noticed the flickering light bulb she'd seen earlier was now completely dead. She pulled a small, laminated card from the pocket of her blue smock. It was her protocol card, a personal checklist she had created, far more detailed than the one the facilities department issued. Under server room PM shift, she made a neat note with a dry erase marker, overhead light C4 out. Potential ballast failure. Note, unit is directly above primary server rack. Risk of falling debris during replacement. This was her process: observe, identify, analyze risk, report. She didn't just clean, she maintained the building's fragile equilibrium. As she was leaving, 2 junior executives, loosened up by the late hour, walked past. They were laughing, unwinding from the day's stress. "Did you see Finch's face in there?" One of them, a young man named Liam, chuckled. "I thought he was going to spontaneously combust." "It's this Guquan thing," his colleague replied, mimicking the interpreter's flustered tone. "Whatever the hell that means, they've been stuck on that one word for 3 hours. Mara froze, her hand on the door jamb. Guquan. Equity. But it was so much more than that. It was the heart of the matter. The word itself was a vessel, and depending on the context, it could carry the meaning of a simple stake or the entire soul of a company. The interpreter was using a dictionary definition, but this was a conversation that required a poet's understanding of nuance. Liam noticed her then, standing half in, half out of the server room. He nudged his friend. "Look at her," he whispered, a smirk in his voice. "Bet she's got an opinion on it, probably an expert on international finance." His friend snorted with laughter. "Yeah, right. Hey, maybe we should send her in. She couldn't do any worse than the guy they're paying $1,000 an hour." The words were meant to be dismissive, casual workplace cruelty. They washed over Mara, and she showed no reaction. She finished closing the server room door, the heavy latch clicking shut with a satisfying finality. She turned her cart and continued down the hall, her posture unchanged, her expression serene. But inside, the fortress was beginning to feel the strain. The bricks were starting to loosen. Would you tolerate this, to be mocked for the very knowledge that could save them? She took a slow, deep breath, the scent of industrial cleaner a familiar anchor in a rising tide of frustration. Her work was her shield, but she wondered, for the first time in a long time, how much longer it could protect her. The energy in the hallway had curdled. What was once tense was now verging on toxic. Doors opened and closed with sharp, angry clicks. The low murmur from the apex had escalated into strained, clipped arguments. Mara could feel the deal entering its death throes. She was buffing the floor outside the CFO office when the door to the apex slid open. The CEO, Mr. Harrison, a man who usually radiated an aura of unflappable control, stormed out. His face was blotchy with stress, his tie loosened. Finch was right behind him, his own composure cracking. "It's one word, Alastair," Harrison hissed, keeping his voice low but failing to conceal its ragged edge. "How can we be hung up on one damn word? The deadline is midnight." "That's 2 hours. The markets in Shanghai open in the morning. If this isn't signed, we're facing a catastrophic loss of confidence." "They're being obstinate," Finch countered, his voice tight. "It's a power play. They know we're up against a wall. The translation is equity. It's a standard term. I say we add a small addendum clarifying the definition in English and push them to sign." Mara, bent over her buffer, felt a cold dread snake up her spine. A clarifying addendum in English would be seen as an insult, a colonialist power move that implied the other party's language was insufficient. It would not only fail to fix the problem, it would detonate the entire negotiation. Finch's solution was born of arrogance and ignorance, a lethal combination in this delicate ecosystem. She now understood the full weight of the situation. Her silence was no longer a personal choice. It was a form of complicity. If she stayed quiet, if she let Finch march back in there with his clumsy, arrogant plan, the company wouldn't just lose a deal. The fallout would cascade downwards. Layoffs would follow. People in accounting, in logistics, people who worked in the mailroom, people like her, would lose their jobs. Her simple, orderly world was perched on the edge of a cliff, and the man about to push it over the edge was convinced he was saving it. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could retreat into the safety of her role, wheel her buffer down the hall, and pretend she heard nothing. She could protect her job, her quiet life. Or she could intervene, stepping out from behind the shield of her invisibility and into the line of fire. She looked at her own reflection in the polished marble, a distorted figure in a blue uniform. The woman staring back at her knew what had to be done. The risks were immense, the chance of failure, of humiliation and termination, incredibly high. But the cost of inaction was a price she was no longer willing to pay. The decision settled over her, quiet and absolute. Her opportunity came moments later. Finch and Harrison disappeared into the CEO office, the door closing with a heavy thud. The hallway was momentarily empty, save for one person, Chloe, the junior analyst, who was frantically gathering documents from a side table, her hands trembling. Her face was pale with the reflected stress of her superiors. Mara knew she had only seconds. She wheeled her cart over, stopping it beside Chloe's table as if to retrieve a used coffee cup. She worked with her back to the CEO office, creating a small, temporary shield. She picked up the cup, but her eyes were on the document in Chloe's hand, a draft of the contentious clause. She saw the characters, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. "That word," Mara said, her voice barely a whisper, not even looking at Chloe directly. "It's a homonym. It can mean a dozen things depending on the measure word you pair it with." Chloe jumped, startled. She looked up at Mara, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. A cleaner was speaking to her about linguistic nuance. The moment felt surreal, a tear in the fabric of the office's rigid hierarchy. "What?" Chloe stammered. "Ask them what the measure word is," Mara continued, her voice calm and even. She placed the cup on her cart. "Ask if it's Haixin." She pronounced the Mandarin word perfectly, the tones precise. It dripped into the silent hallway like a secret. She didn't wait for a response. She simply pushed her cart away, resuming her slow, methodical journey down the hall, leaving Chloe standing frozen by the table. She had planted a seed. It was a small act, a quiet word of warning, but it was the first move in a game no one else knew she was playing. From the corner of her eye, she saw the door to Harrison's office open again. Finch stepped out. He hadn't heard the words, but he saw the aftermath, Chloe staring into the distance, a document clutched in her hand, and the cleaning lady, now 20 feet away, moving with an unnerving purpose. Finch's eyes narrowed. He looked from Chloe back to Mara, a flicker of suspicion crossing his features. He didn't know what he had just seen, but his instincts told him a rule had been broken. The small win of warning Chloe was immediately shaded by the long, dark shadow of his bias. The weight of the night finally broke Chloe. 20 minutes later, Mara found her in a small, out-of-the-way alcove that housed a vending machine and a recycling bin. She was slumped in a chair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The pressure, the fear, the casual cruelty of men like Finch, it had all become too much. Mara approached without a sound. She didn't speak. She simply reached into the small cooler on the bottom of her cart and retrieved a cold, unopened bottle of water. She placed it on the small table beside Chloe, the plastic bottle making a soft thud. Chloe looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She saw Mara, and for a moment, her analyst's brain struggled to compute. Then, the memory of the hallway, the whispered Mandarin word, came flooding back. "He yelled at me," Chloe whispered, her voice hoarse. "I tried to ask about the word you said. He told me I was out of my depth and to stop listening to a janitor." Her voice cracked on the last word. "He said if I mentioned it again, he'd have me fired for insubordination." Mara pulled a small packet of tissues from her smock and offered it to Chloe. "His fear is not your failure," she said softly. It was a simple sentence, but it was delivered with a certainty that seemed to cut through Chloe's panic. Chloe took the tissues, dabbing at her eyes. "I don't know what to do. I know they're making a mistake. I can feel it, but he's right. I'm just an analyst. No one will listen to me." "Truth doesn't need a title to be true," Mara replied, repeating the sentiment, grounding it. She looked at Chloe, at her youth, her ambition, her frustrated intelligence. She saw a younger version of herself, before the world had taught her to build fortresses and hide behind a uniform. In that moment, her mission crystallized. It wasn't just about a contract or a company anymore. It was about this young woman and every other person in the building who had a voice but was never given a platform. It was a moral obligation. If you were there, would you step closer or stay silent? Mara had made her choice. She would not let Chloe's voice or her own be silenced. She would stand in the gap. She gave Chloe's shoulder a brief, gentle squeeze, a gesture of solidarity that crossed every class and corporate line, and then she walked away, leaving the young analyst with a bottle of water and a newfound, fragile sliver of hope. Mara knew she needed to see the final document, not a draft, not a copy, but the actual pages they intended to sign. The building's protocol for high-security documents was clear. After final review, they were placed in a locked folio and left on the credenza in the CEO office for a final 10-minute cooling-off period before being taken back for the signing. Her access to that floor was a privilege of her post-10 p.m. shift, when the executives were gone. Tonight they were still here, but their frantic movements left gaps in their defenses. She timed her entrance perfectly. Harrison and Finch were back in the apex for one last, desperate attempt at persuasion. The CEO office was empty. It was part of her route, a room she was authorized to clean. She entered, her card a perfect alibi. The folio was there, a handsome leather case on the polished mahogany credenza. It wasn't locked. In their haste, they had forgotten. It was a fatal error born of panic. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Her gloved hands were steady. She opened the folio. Inside were two versions of the contract, side by side. One in English, one in Mandarin. Her eyes scanned the English version of Clause 7.2. It read, "Upon regulatory approval, the new partnership entity will be granted a minority equity stake of 12%, with no voting rights attached to this initial issuance." It seemed clear, ironclad. A minority stake. Then she turned to the Mandarin version. Her finger traced the elegant, deadly characters. The clause was the same, but for two critical words. Instead of just Guquan, the text read Haixin Guquan, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, core ownership rights. It was a dagger hidden in plain sight. A term that, in the context of Chinese corporate law, implied not just a stake in the profits, but a foundational claim on the company's core assets, its patents, its intellectual property, its very identity. The 12% was not a minority stake. It was a 12% claim on the entire company, triggered the moment the ink was dry. It was a corporate Trojan horse. This was no mistranslation. This was a deliberate, brilliantly conceived trap. The ambiguity was the weapon. They were counting on the Americans' linguistic arrogance, their reliance on a simplistic, literal translation. Mara closed the folio, a cold, hard certainty settling in her gut. She now held the proof. The trap was not just identified. She understood its mechanics down to the last screw. And she knew she was the only one in the building who could disarm it. Her discovery came at a price. As she was leaving the CEO office, her task complete, she nearly collided with Finch, who was coming out of the washroom. He stopped dead, his eyes flicking from her face to the closed folio on the credenza, then back to her. A dark, ugly suspicion bloomed on his face. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was an accusation. 10 minutes later, the call came. It wasn't Finch or Harrison. It was her direct supervisor, a weary man named David who managed the night crew. His voice was apologetic but firm. "Mara, there's been a complaint from Mr. Finch." Mara stood in the janitorial closet on the 40th floor, the scent of bleach and lavender hanging in the air. She said nothing. "He said you were somewhere you weren't supposed to be, handling documents." "He's calling it a security risk," David continued, the words sounding rehearsed. "Look, I know it's nonsense, but my hands are tied. They want you off the executive floor for the rest of the night. I have to reassign you to the basement levels, parking garage detail." It was a calculated move, not a firing that would require paperwork evidence. This was an exile, banishment to the concrete catacombs of the building, far from the flow of information, far from any chance of intervention. Her access card, she soon discovered, was already deactivated for every floor above the lobby. She was cut off, caged. She tried calling Chloe's extension, but it went straight to voicemail. The system was closing ranks, protecting its own. Finch had acted swiftly and decisively, using the corporate hierarchy as a weapon to neutralize a threat he didn't understand but instinctively feared. He had isolated her completely. She took the service elevator down to the P4 level. The air grew cold, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. The pristine marble and pressurized quiet of the 40th floor felt a world away. Here, the only sounds were the lonely hum of fluorescent lights and the distant drip of water. This was where they sent the problems, the people they wanted to forget. She stood for a moment in the cavernous, empty garage, her cleaning cart looking small and out of place. She was alone, silenced, and stripped of her access. The sense of defeat was a physical weight. What would you sacrifice to stay true? She looked at her reflection in the dark window of a parked sedan. She saw a woman in a blue uniform, a ghost in a concrete tomb. But then she looked closer, past the uniform, into her own eyes, and she saw not defeat, but a cold, burning resolve. They had taken her access, but they hadn't taken her knowledge. They had put her in a cage, but they had forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous animal is the one you corner. Upstairs, the world was ending. The final, desperate meeting in the apex had ended in disaster. Mr. Chen and the Chinese delegation, their faces masks of cold fury after Finch's insulting addendum proposal, had stood up in unison. The interpreter, having been berated by both sides, had a small, spectacular breakdown, shouting, "I quit," in 3 different languages before storming out of the room. The deal was not just dead, it was a smoldering crater. Panic ripped through the executive wing. The CEO, Harrison, looked like he had aged a decade in the last hour. The $200 million deal was gone. The stock would plummet on the morning bell. His career was likely over. "What happened?" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the now silent boardroom. "What did we miss?" Finch, pale and sweating, stammered. "It was the interpreter. His incompetence." "It wasn't the interpreter." The voice was small but clear. It was Chloe. She stood by the door, trembling from head to toe, but her eyes were defiant. All heads turned to her. "What did you say?" Harrison demanded. "It wasn't the interpreter," she repeated, louder this time. "It was the word, the clause. We misunderstood it." "We've been misunderstanding it all night." Finch shot her a look of pure venom. "You're out of line, Chloe. You have no idea what you're talking about." "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But she does." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the room of stunned, powerful men. "There is someone who understands all of this, who speaks fluent Mandarin, who tried to warn us." A heavy silence fell over the room. Harrison stared at her, his desperation overriding his skepticism. Who are you talking about? Chloe met his gaze, her chin held high. Her name is Mara, she said. She's on the night crew. And then she delivered the final, damning line. But you sent her to the basement. The room was utterly still. The executives looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and the dawning, horrifying realization that their salvation might just be 400 feet below them, polishing the floor of the parking garage. The stage was set. The hero, cast out and dismissed, was about to be summoned. The service elevator ascended with a slow, hydraulic groan, a metal box rising from the building's concrete guts to its glittering brain. Mara stood inside, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. She had shed her blue uniform smock. She was wearing what she always wore underneath, a simple pair of black trousers and a crisp, white, button-down shirt. She was not arriving as a cleaner. She was arriving as herself. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, a security guard was waiting to escort her. The hallway was lined with anxious-looking executives who parted like water as she approached. They stared at her, their expressions a cocktail of bewilderment and desperate hope. She met no one's eye. Her focus was entirely on the open doors of the apex. She walked into the silent, hostile boardroom. The air was thick with failure. Mr. Chen and his delegation were standing by the window, their briefcases in hand, moments from departing forever. Harrison stood at the head of the table, a broken man. Finch was by his side, his face a thunderous mask of rage and disbelief. Mara didn't look at them. She walked directly towards the Chinese delegation and stopped a respectful 10 feet away. She bowed her head slightly, and then she spoke. Nin hao, Shane Dongshi. Wo wai women de wuji ganda o kiane. Wo renwei wenti chu zai haixin yuquan jij sai shang. Her voice was calm, melodic, her Mandarin flawless, formal, and imbued with a respect that had been absent all night. Hello, Director Chen. I apologize for our misunderstanding. I believe the issue is with the term core ownership rights. The entire room froze. Mr. Chen, who had been staring out the window, turned slowly. His eyes, cold and hard moments before, widened in stunned surprise. He looked at Mara, truly seeing her for the first time. Without waiting for a reply, Mara turned and walked to the large whiteboard at the front of the room. She picked up a black dry erase marker. The cap came off with a soft pop that echoed in the dead silence. And then, her performance began. With clean, precise strokes, she wrote the two terms side by side. On the left, in English, minority equity stake. On the right, in Mandarin, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. She began to speak, her voice even and clear, switching effortlessly between perfect, unaccented English and nuanced academic Mandarin. She wasn't just translating words, she was decoding cultures. In English, equity is a financial instrument, she explained, looking at Harrison and his team. It is a percentage of profit, a share. It is fundamentally passive. She turned to the other side of the board. In a Chinese corporate context, Haixin Yuquan is not passive. It is an active stake in the foundational assets and decision-making authority of the enterprise. It is a concept rooted in shared destiny, not just shared profit. She diagrammed the legal and financial implications, drawing arrows and flow charts. She showed how the English version of Clause 7.2 created a simple partnership, while the Mandarin version enacted a transfer of core intellectual property. She explained the cultural context of trust, and how the ambiguous wording from the Chinese perspective was not a simple mistake but a profound gesture of bad faith, an attempt to trick them. The room was mesmerized. It was a masterclass in law, linguistics, and cross-cultural communication. Finch's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. Harrison was leaning forward, his mouth slightly agape, hanging on her every word. When she finished, she placed the cap back on the marker. Click. She turned to Mr. Chen. He was staring at her, his expression one of deep, unadulterated respect. He spoke in Mandarin. Nai jishi de bai women ziji de lushi hai yao touch, nai de odi shi shei. You explain this better than our own lawyers. Who are you? Mara simply held his gaze. She didn't need to answer. The shift in the room was palpable, a seismic transfer of power. The janitor they had dismissed and exiled now commanded the most important room in their entire company. Did you feel that shift? The quiet click of the marker cap had been the sound of a new world order snapping into place. In the hour that followed, Mara, with Mr. Chen's team, rewrote the clause. The new wording was precise, respectful, and mutually beneficial. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a strange, buoyant sense of awe. Just before midnight, the contract was signed. The deal was saved. The next morning, Mara was summoned not to the basement, but to the CEO office. Harrison was behind his desk. Finch was conspicuously absent. The CEO looked humbled, his usual arrogance replaced by a quiet respect. "Mara," he began, gesturing to the plush leather chair opposite him. "I don't know what to say. Thank you isn't enough. You saved this company." Yesterday, Alastair Finch tendered his resignation. It was accepted. He slid a folder across the desk. "This is an offer. Vice President of a new global strategy division. We'll build it around you. The salary is significant. It's a corner office. It's yours." Mara looked at the folder but didn't open it. She thought of the mockery from the junior executives, Finch's condescending dismissal, her exile to the garage. She had the power now to demand anything. She could have taken the title, the money, the office. She could have ascended, but she chose a different path. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice even, "but I don't want a new title." Harrison looked confused. "I don't understand." "Last night the problem wasn't a bad clause," Mara explained. "It was a broken system, a system that is blind. It's blind to the skills of the people who work for you. It's blind to the value of anyone who doesn't wear a suit." She pushed the folder gently back across the desk. "I don't want a promotion," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet authority. "I want a new system. I want a protocol that finds the hidden talents in this company before a crisis. A program that sees the people you have, not just the titles they hold. I will not take a desk to help you manage the old way of doing things, but I will help you build a new one." It was not a request for revenge or reward. It was a demand for systemic change. It was an act of soft justice, aimed not at punishing the guilty, but at creating a future where such mistakes would be impossible. Harrison stared at her, realizing that the woman who had saved his company was now offering to rebuild it from the ground up. They didn't just listen, they acted. Within a month, the company, guided by Mara's clear, logical framework, implemented the Internal Skills Assessment Initiative. It was a clunky, corporate name. Everyone in the building, from the mailroom to the boardroom, called it the Mara Protocol. The policy was revolutionary in its simplicity. It was a voluntary, anonymized database, accessible through the company's internal portal. Every employee, regardless of rank or role, could list their skills, certifications, language fluencies, and even past careers. A maintenance worker who was a certified welder, an administrative assistant with a master's degree in library science, perfect for organizing digital assets. A barista in the ground floor cafe who was a native speaker of Portuguese. The change was specific, measurable, and woven into the fabric of the company's operations. A new HR mandate required every hiring manager to consult the protocol database and conduct at least one internal interview before seeking any external candidates or consultants. It was a simple rule, but it fundamentally altered the company's DNA. It shifted the corporate mindset from acquiring talent to discovering talent. Mara oversaw the implementation, not from a corner office but from a small, functional workspace they gave her in the training department. She worked with IT to design the interface, with HR to draft the communications, and with department heads to ensure compliance. She was not a vice president. Her title was Protocol Administrator, but her influence was greater than any VP's. She hadn't just saved one deal. She had created a system that would prevent countless future crises by assuming that competence, and even brilliance, could be found anywhere. The rulebook had been rewritten. Several weeks later, an invitation appeared on her desk. It was from Mr. Chen. He was back in the city for a follow-up meeting and requested the pleasure of her company for tea. He suggested the company's quiet garden atrium on the 10th floor. He also noted he had invited Chloe. It was a cool, overcast afternoon. The atrium was a peaceful oasis of green in the steel and glass jungle. There were no executives, no lawyers, no one from the 40th floor. It was just the three of them. Mara sat with Mr. Chen and Chloe at a small table, a pot of fragrant jasmine tea between them. For a while they just talked. Chloe, more confident and relaxed than Mara had ever seen her, spoke about her new role on the implementation team for the merger. She was thriving. Then Mr. Chen turned to Mara. He spoke in Mandarin, his voice gentle. Wo de zufu shi yij mujiang, ta de xiao yi fei fan, keshi zai bie rain yan lai, ta yang yuan du jishi ji gong grain. My grandfather was a carpenter, he said. His hands could create beauty from raw wood, but to the world he was always just a laborer. He poured her another cup of tea, the pale liquid swirling in the delicate porcelain. He then switched to perfect English so Chloe could understand. He taught me that excellence has its own voice. It does not shout. It is a quiet thing, a steady thing. You reminded my entire team of what it means to listen for it. Mara simply smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. In this quiet garden, surrounded by the gentle rustle of leaves, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she was missing. Her dignity had not been restored by a paycheck or a title. It was restored here, in this moment of quiet conversation, in the shared respect of peers who saw her not for the uniform she had worn, but for the mind she possessed. It was a healing that no corporate apology could ever provide. The first real test of the Mara Protocol came a month later. The company was entering into a preliminary negotiation with a Brazilian tech firm. A young, ambitious manager in the business development department, Tom, was leading the project. His first instinct was to follow the old playbook. He put in a requisition to hire an external Portuguese translator for $10,000 a week. The request was automatically flagged by the new HR system. An alert popped up on his screen, protocol match found. Have you consulted the internal database? Annoyed, Tom clicked the link. The database search took 5 seconds. It returned one result, a man named Carlos, who worked in the central mailroom. His profile listed native fluency in Brazilian Portuguese, and to Tom's astonishment, a bachelor's degree in finance from a university in Sao Paulo. The CEO, Harrison, heard about it later that day. He had made it his business to track the protocol's early successes. He didn't send a company-wide email. He didn't make a grand announcement. He simply walked down to the small office where Mara was working. She was reviewing data, tracking the protocol's adoption rates. He didn't knock, just leaned against the doorframe. Carlos from the mailroom is sitting in on the Brazil negotiation, Harrison said. He's already flagged 2 potential accounting discrepancies in their preliminary offer. Mara looked up from her screen, a small, knowing smile on her face. Harrison just nodded. Thank you, he said. The words were simple, unadorned. There was no fanfare, no ceremony. It was a direct, specific acknowledgement from one competent person to another. Your system works. He turned and walked away. The recognition was quiet, private, and focused entirely on the efficacy of her creation. It was more meaningful than any plaque or public praise. Her work was speaking for itself, and its voice was getting louder every day. The company's quarterly new hire orientation was a standard, soul-crushing affair of presentations and paperwork. But now, there was a new, mandatory final session, Introduction to the Mara Protocol. Mara herself led the session. She stood at the front of a small auditorium, not as a lecturer, but as a guide. She explained the philosophy behind the system, that every person in the room possessed a unique combination of skills and experiences, and that the company was now architected to recognize them. At the end of the session, she walked down the aisle, handing each new employee a small, welcome gift. It was a brand new, redesigned version of her laminated protocol card. It was no longer a simple, personal checklist. The new card, sleek and professionally designed with the company logo, had 2 sides. On one side was a space for the employee to write their own personal protocols, their goals, their methods, their professional creed. On the other side, beneath a section titled Quiet Observation, was a simple, powerful reminder printed in clean, sans serif font. What skills are in this room that we haven't seen? What knowledge is present that we haven't asked for? Who holds the solution we haven't looked for? The object that had once been the private symbol of her unseen labor, the tool of an invisible woman, was now a public totem. It was a physical manifestation of the company's new philosophy, a tool for seeing the unseen. She placed a card in the hand of a young, nervous-looking intern. Their eyes met. In that moment, the card was no longer just Mara's. It belonged to everyone. Did the object's meaning change for you too? It had transformed from a symbol of her isolation into a symbol of their collective potential. Months melted into a year. The Mara Protocol was no longer a novelty. It was simply the way things were done. It had led to the promotion of a security guard with an expired but valid paramedic certification to the head of the company's new on-site emergency response team. It had discovered a woman in accounts payable with a background in graphic design, who now created all of the company's internal marketing materials. The building was alive with newly visible talent. The final scene is quiet. Mara is walking down the hallway on the 40th floor. She is not cleaning. She is not an executive. She is an observer, a new kind of role they created just for her, systems auditor. Her job is to walk the floors and watch the systems, human and technical, at work, looking for inefficiencies, for people who are being overlooked, for better ways of doing things. She passes the main boardroom, the apex. The glass is, as always, immaculately clean. Inside, a high-stakes negotiation is underway. And at the table, no longer a junior analyst taking notes but a confident project co-lead, is Chloe. She is speaking with authority, making a sharp, insightful point. Mara pauses, unseen in the hallway. She watches as Chloe finishes her point and then pauses, taking a sip of water. As she sets the glass down, she instinctively reaches out and straightens a small, laminated card that rests on the table beside her laptop. Her protocol card. Mara nods to herself, a slow, satisfied nod that no one else sees. She turns and continues down the hall, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble. Her work here was done. She hadn't climbed the ladder. She had redesigned the building so that everyone had the tools to build their own. Her brilliance didn't get her a seat at the table. It had changed the blueprint of the room itself, and her legacy was in the quiet confidence of every person who now knew they would be seen. Whose quiet excellence do you see every day?